That Sunday morning, the Pennsylvania sun was cutting just right through the clouds, spilling over the hood of my old Chevy Malibu. Right next to me in the passenger seat sat a box, wrapped tight in gold paper. I'd even used the edge of my scissors to curl the ribbon just so. It sat there perfectly still, looking like some kind of rare treasure. Porch. My hands started shaking before I even put the car in park. I told myself it was just excitement. I told myself a lot of lies that morning. I hadn't called ahead to tell him I was coming. But for 30 years, my dropping by had never been an issue. In a normal family, a mother delivering a birthday gift to her son doesn't need an appointment. Porch. I walked up the 3 wooden steps of his porch, my heart beating with that soft, hopeful feeling you only get when you still believe the person on the other side of the door loves you just as much as you love them. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. It was like he'd been standing there watching through the blinds the whole time. My name is Ginny Blackwood. Porch. And the boy standing in that doorway was the only child I'd ever had, and the only one I ever needed. He didn't smile. He didn't step back to let me in. His big frame filled the entire doorway, one hand gripping the frame tight, and the other flat against the door itself, like he was bracing for a storm. "Danny," I said softly, holding out the gift. "Happy birthday, sweetheart." Porch. He didn't even look at the box. His eyes darted right past my shoulder, scanning the street behind me to see if anyone was watching. Then, his gaze snapped back to my face. Something in his eyes had gone completely cold and mechanical, like an actor repeating lines he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in a mirror. "My wife's family doesn't want you here," he said, his voice totally flat. "Porch. Take your gift and go." I stood there frozen, the gold ribbon brushing against my knuckles. Down the street, someone's golden retriever was barking, and a Ford pickup rumbled past. It all felt so surreal, like I'd opened the wrong door and stepped into someone else's nightmare. "Danny!" I said his name again, because I honestly couldn't find any other words. Porch. 30 years, and I didn't have a single line ready for this. "I'm serious, Mom." His voice cracked just a tiny bit on the word Mom, just a slight tremor, but it was enough for me to hear the fragile boy trapped inside that grown man's body. "Please, just go." Porch. If you're listening to this, and you've ever had the child you raised look at you like you're a complete stranger, please tell me where you are. I just want to know I'm not the only one carrying this kind of pain alone. I wanted so badly to ask him what happened. Porch. I wanted to ask who had gotten inside his head and turned my wonderful son into this cold stranger. A man who could stand in a doorway and say those things to the mother who raised him alone, working late nights just to keep food on the table. For 29 years, I had never raised my voice at him once. But nothing came out. My throat felt like concrete, blocking all my questions. So, I did the only thing my legs would let me do. I turned around, walked down those 3 steps, and got back in my car. Before I turned the key in the ignition, I sat there staring at the gift on my lap, wondering if I should just left it on the porch instead of taking it back. When I looked up, he was already closing the door. Porch. But in that split second before it shut completely, I caught a glimpse of his hand on the frame. It was shaking violently. Not from the cold, and not from anger. It was the kind of shaking that happens when a man is fighting with everything he has to hold back something that's tearing him apart from the inside. That image stuck with me all the way home. Porch. Those shaking hands were screaming the truth. He didn't want me to leave. Before my car even reached my driveway, I called him 4 times. 4 calls, all going straight to voicemail. His cheerful, upbeat greeting echoed in the car, sounding like nothing was wrong in the world. Porch. I held the steering wheel with one hand and kept the phone pressed to my ear until the screen went dark twice, but I didn't hang up. I just watched it go black in my palm. This wasn't him. In 30 years, my son had never let my calls just ring out and fade away. I started thinking about our Sunday phone calls. Porch. Ever since he moved out at 22, every Sunday night at 7, he'd call like clockwork, whether he had 5 minutes or 50. It didn't matter how tired he was from his construction job, or if he and his wife Isabella had some neighborhood dinner to go to. Porch. He'd always call, and I could hear him sinking into his chair on the other end, saying softly, "Hey, Mom." He sounded so genuinely happy that the week had finally brought him back to me. I thought about the birthdays. Not his, but mine. Year after year, he never missed one. Porch. Even the year he had a terrible flu and could barely stand up, he still showed up at my door with a card written in a shaky hand, apologizing for the messy handwriting. I told him then that the words were what mattered, not the handwriting. But he still hugged me tight, like he needed to be forgiven for something much bigger than messy writing. I thought about the year his father passed away. Porch. Danny was only 12, far too young to carry that heavy, suffocating adult grief. But he was mature enough to know his mother needed someone to lean on. From then on, every single morning before school, he would walk me out to my car just so I wouldn't have to stand where his father used to stand alone. A 12-year-old boy did that for me every day. Porch. 18 years had flown by, and my son had just turned 30. That was the birthday that brought me to his door, gift in hand, full of hope. But the boy I raised had completely vanished behind the man blocking the doorway today. I let the phone rest on my lap, letting myself feel the crushing weight of it all. Porch. It wasn't just the words he said, it was the absolute lifelessness in his eyes. Like someone had reached into his soul and flipped a switch. It wasn't disrespect. If it were just disrespect, I could handle that. This was closer to fear. And seeing fear in my son was a language I didn't understand, because I'd spent 30 years making sure he'd never have to speak it. Porch. I picked up my phone again, my thumb hovering over his name, ready to call him back like any angry mother would to demand an explanation. But halfway through, something stopped me. If I called him now, acting angry and hurt, he'd either lock down even tighter or tell me some quick lie just to get me off his back. I know my son. When he's cornered, he shuts down. Porch. And a silent man won't tell you the truth. He'll just say whatever keeps the peace. So, I put the phone back on the passenger seat, right next to the gold ribbon box that was now slightly dented from how hard I'd been gripping it. Sitting there in my car, looking at my quiet, dark house, I made a decision. I wasn't going to call him first. Not tonight, and not tomorrow. Porch. Whatever had turned my son into a stranger on his own porch, I had to figure it out before I spoke another word to him. The next time we faced each other, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I sat in the car, forcing my mind to go back much further than this morning. If some kind of crisis was brewing in my son's life, it didn't start today. It didn't start last week either. Porch. I closed my eyes and let my memories rewind through our normal, everyday life, looking for the very first crack I might have missed. It didn't take long to find one. It was 3 months ago, at a 4th of July barbecue. We were in my sister's backyard, family crowded around folding tables and smoking grills. Porch. I remembered Danny standing by the cooler filled with ice-cold drinks, laughing at some joke Uncle Bobby made. That was probably the last time he looked like himself. Isabella was standing a few feet away, talking to my sister about their kitchen remodel. Porch. Everything about that afternoon was perfectly normal. Paper plates piled with food, country music playing softly from a radio, and kids running around with sparklers even though it wasn't dark yet. That was when Danny reached out to grab a second scoop of my sister's potato salad. Isabella's voice cut right across the yard. Porch. It sounded bright and cheerful on the surface, but underneath it was sharp as a blade. "Babe, are you sure about that? Didn't you say you were watching your diet?" She was smiling the whole time she said it. Big, bright smile, but her eyes were locked onto him, completely still, waiting to see what he'd do. I watched my son's hand freeze mid-air over that bowl. Porch. It just hovered there, like some internal switch had been yanked down. He put the spoon back without taking a bite, mumbled something I couldn't hear, and stepped away from the table, looking exactly like a kid caught red-handed. That wasn't my Danny. My son never apologized for eating at a family barbecue. porch. He was always the guy who went back for thirds and joked about how his mother raised him never to waste good food. 3 months ago, I just figured it was Isabella being controlling about small things, like some wives are. I told myself their marriage was their business and I should stay out of it. So I went back to my seat and didn't think twice. Porch. But now, looking back at that moment after what happened on his porch, that didn't look like a wife caring about her husband's health. That looked like a loyalty test. She was checking to see if he'd fall in line, even in front of his own family. And then I remembered something else. Something I'd pushed deep down. Porch. Right after the potato salad thing, Uncle Bobby came over with his plate and leaned toward my lawn chair, keeping his voice incredibly low. "Are you okay?" he asked. But he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were locked on Danny's back. My son was walking toward the house, his shoulders tense and pulled up high, like a man bracing against a heavy wind, even though there wasn't even a breeze that day. Porch. I had waved it off back then. I told Bobby I was fine. We were all fine. It was just a barbecue. But he wasn't asking if I was okay. He was asking, "Do you see what I see?" 3 months later, sitting in my driveway with an undelivered gift on my lap, I finally allowed myself to answer the question I had run from. No, I wasn't okay. Porch. I had been so unsettled by the vibe that day that I was too scared to say it out loud. Some part of me knew that underneath that silly argument over potato salad, something much darker was going on, even if I couldn't put a name to it yet. I sat in my car until my legs went numb, my brain still searching through the past, looking for any little detail I might have brushed off. Porch. It stopped on a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon, about 6 weeks after the barbecue and 2 months before his birthday. I had called Danny that day to ask if he could swing by and help me unload some heavy bags of mulch from my car to the backyard. In the past, I wouldn't even have to finish the sentence before he'd agree. Sure enough, he showed up in his truck less than an hour later. Porch. We worked side by side in the humid air, him insisting on doing all the heavy lifting as usual. After we finished, we were both hot and thirsty. I asked if he wanted to walk down to the corner store with me to grab a couple of sodas and some ice. It was a tiny errand. Porch. A year ago, he wouldn't have blinked. He would have tossed a $5 bill on the counter and told the cashier to keep the change just to make her smile. But at the counter that Tuesday, the total came to $6.40. I watched him open his wallet, and his hands slowed down. It was a kind of hesitation that caught my attention before I even understood why. Porch. He pulled out 5 $1 bills very slowly, like he was doing some complicated math in his head that didn't need to be done. Then he started digging through his pockets for change, patting down the jacket he'd thrown on that morning. He was short 60 cents. Porch. I watched my son, a man who used to leave $20 tips on a $5 bar tab without a thought, standing at a convenience store counter, desperately searching his pockets for a few coins. Before he had to ask me for help, I stepped in. I slid a dollar bill across the counter naturally, acting like nothing happened, pretending I hadn't just seen his pride take a hit. Porch. Walking back to the car, I couldn't keep quiet. "Are you and Isabella doing okay?" I asked, keeping my voice light the way you talk to a startled animal. "I mean, financially." He didn't answer right away. He stared at the parking lot like there was something incredibly interesting out there. His jaw was clenched, like he was carefully picking which words were safe to say out loud. Porch. "Just a little tight lately, Mom," he finally said. "Business is slow. You know how construction is, there are always off-seasons." Of course I knew. I'd watched him go through 3 or 4 slow seasons over the years. But none of those slow seasons had ever turned him into a man who panicked over 60 cents. This was different. Porch. It felt like a cover-up for something much bigger, a crisis he had decided I could never know about. I dropped the subject right there in the parking lot because my gut told me that pushing him would only make him shut the door completely. But I never forgot the look in his eyes. It didn't match his voice at all. His voice was calm and practiced. maybe a little too smooth. Porch. But his eyes looked somewhere else entirely. Somewhere tired, scared, and dark. I got in the car, drove him home, and never brought it up again. But I carried that look with me, turning it over in my mind like a heavy stone. Whatever was squeezing his life tight, it wasn't just about money. Money doesn't make a grown man's hands shake like that. Fear does. Porch. It was a week after the convenience store incident, before Danny called me again. He didn't apologize for being distant. He just gave me a cautious invitation, like he was testing to see if the door between us was still open. He said Isabella was going out of town for 2 days, with her mother for some work stuff, and asked if I wanted to come over. He didn't mention his birthday, and I didn't ask. Porch. I went. Whatever pride I had left didn't matter compared to seeing my son. He looked thinner than I remembered, even though it hadn't been that long since I last saw him. The exhaustion in his eyes was the kind that sleep couldn't fix. We sat at his expensive oak dining table for a while, talking about nothing. Porch. We were both dancing around a giant elephant in the room, neither of us wanting to bring it up. Then his phone rang with a work call. He walked out to the garage to take it, telling me he'd be a few minutes. I sat there alone, with nothing to do, looking for a distraction. Porch. Next to the hallway sat a laundry basket overflowing with clothes, a jacket hanging halfway out, looking like it was about to slide onto the floor. I reached over to catch it, intending to just toss it back in. That was when I felt something crinkle in the pocket. It was a small, light jacket, and I recognized it as one Isabella often threw over her shoulders. I swear I wasn't trying to snoop. Porch. The paper practically slid into my hand on its own. It was a small piece of paper, torn at the edges, like it had been ripped off a larger sheet. It was crumpled up, clearly meant to be thrown away, but somehow forgotten in the pocket. I almost put it back, without looking. Almost. I don't know what made me unfold it. Porch. Maybe some part of me had been waiting for proof ever since he stood in that doorway. It was Isabella's handwriting. Slanted, messy, the kind of writing when someone is in a rush and their mind is racing. It looked like someone jotting down a plan, then realizing it was too dangerous to keep. Most of the paper was ripped away, but the sentence left behind sat right there in my hand. Porch. This money before anyone finds out. Do not say a word to your mother. You know what happens if you do. I stood in that quiet hallway, the dryer humming in the background. I read that line 3 times. In that moment, my blood ran cold. Money. It wasn't just a marriage rough patch, or a wife being picky about potato salad or 60 cents. This was serious. Porch. This was a plan she had written down, something she wanted destroyed, something I was never supposed to see. Before I heard Danny's footsteps coming back from the garage, I stuffed the paper into my pocket, my knuckles turning white. By the time he walked back into the kitchen, I had hung the jacket neatly over the chair and put on a face calm enough to hide what I'd just found. Porch. I didn't ask him about the note that day. I knew if I did, he'd either lie to protect her or shut down completely. I'd get nothing out of him except a front row seat to how good he'd gotten at hiding things from me. So, I drove home with that scrap of paper burning a hole in my pocket. That night, sitting in my quiet kitchen, I made a promise to myself. 2 days. Porch. I would give myself exactly 2 days before I did anything. In 2 days, I was going to find out the truth, no matter what. Because sitting there, I knew one thing for sure. The person who could give me answers was not my son. The people I needed to see were Isabella's parents. I gave myself 2 days. During that time, I kept rehearsing what I was going to say to them. Porch. Aside from polite nods at the wedding 3 years ago, we had never actually sat down and talked. I knew where they lived. A massive brick house with a circular driveway right by the golf club, with perfectly trimmed hedges that screamed money. I'd only been there once for the engagement dinner. Porch. I remembered feeling completely out of place, thinking any single piece of furniture in that house probably cost more than my entire home. But this morning, as I drove up that wide driveway, I didn't feel out of place at all. I felt something much stronger. the fierce, protective instinct of a mother. Eleanor herself answered the door, not a housekeeper. Porch. When she saw me standing on her porch uninvited, a look of surprise crossed her face. "Ginny," she said cautiously, trying to see if my visit was friendly. Is everything okay?" "I need to speak with you and Arthur," I said firmly. "Both of you, if he's home." She hesitated for just a second before stepping back to let me in. Porch. The quickness of her movement told me everything. She'd been half dreading, half expecting someone to knock on this door for a while. Arthur walked in from the next room, loosening his tie. I didn't waste time on polite small talk. I walked straight over to their massive marble kitchen island and slapped the torn piece of paper down on the counter, still creased from being clutched in my pocket. Porch. "My son stood on his own porch and told me your family doesn't want me around," I said, looking from one to the other. "And then I found this in his jacket. I need to know what's going on. Because I don't believe for a second that you two told him to treat me like that." I watched their faces as they read the note. I was ready for them to be defensive, to deny it, or to protect their daughter. Instead, I watched something completely collapse in both of them. It was a quiet, crushing realization. "We never said anything like that to him," Arthur said, his voice low. I believed him instantly. It was the tone of a man who had just been handed a truth too heavy to carry. Eleanor slowly sat down at the table, her hand pressed to her chest as if she were in physical pain. "We had no idea what he was going through," she whispered. We thought it was just the business, that things were tight. We gave them that loan because we love him." "Because Isabella came to us crying." "What loan?" I interrupted. Eleanor looked up at Arthur, a silent conversation passing between them, weighing how much of the truth was safe to share. Arthur gave a small nod, giving her his permission. "A little over a year ago, Isabella came to us." Eleanor's voice started to tremble. "She said Danny's construction company was in serious trouble, that they needed money immediately to save it. Our lawyers drew up a simple agreement, just between the two of them, to keep things official. Then we wired the money directly into an account Isabella managed. It was almost $1 million. She paused, swallowing hard, like saying the number out loud hurt. "We didn't even hesitate. She's our daughter." I sat there, letting that massive number sink in, feeling the ground beneath me completely drop away. "But after that, things changed," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a whisper, like she was admitting it to herself for the first time. "Once the money was wired, Isabella became different. Especially after that issue with the first payment." "What issue with the first payment?" I pressed. Arthur and Eleanor exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. A defensive shadow seemed to pass between them, and neither of them answered my question directly. Eleanor just squeezed her husband's hand on the table, and the topic slipped away before I could push any further. The beautiful kitchen went completely silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock somewhere nearby. In that heavy silence, sitting across from the couple I had been ready to blame, I realized the hard truth. We had all been looking at the wrong villain this entire time. After Eleanor said those words, nobody moved for a long time. The clock kept ticking. I let the silence stretch because I could see the struggle in their eyes as they decided how much to reveal about a woman they realized they didn't truly know. "Changed? How?" I finally asked. Arthur rubbed his face and sighed deeply. "She used to call her mother every day. Now it's maybe once a week, and she's always in a rush, distracted. Around the time we sent the money, she stopped coming to our Sunday dinners. She told us Danny's work schedule had just gotten too busy." He paused. "Except Danny's schedule has always been busy. That wasn't new." I thought about my own son, about how for years, through bad weather and holidays, he'd always made time to call his mother every single Sunday. That detail from Arthur cut deep. "Can I ask you something?" I looked at them. "When Isabella came to you for the money, saying the business was failing, how did she describe things?" "She said they were days away from losing everything," Arthur said. his voice heavy with memory. She said we had to move fast, or there'd be nothing left to save. I thought about those words, because they didn't match the reality I knew at all. Orch. That's not what Danny told me, I said slowly. Around that same time, he called me, sounding proud. He told me he'd just landed a major commercial contract. He said after a really tough stretch, things were finally starting to stabilize. I remember it clearly because it was the first good news I'd heard from him in months. The air in the kitchen went ice cold. He told you, Orch. Things were stabilizing? Eleanor repeated, as if trying to see if those words could possibly fit into the version of the story she'd been told. Yes, right around the same time you're talking about. And yet she told you they were going under. I looked at her. Orch. Arthur and Eleanor stared at each other, and I saw a sudden realization pass between them. Not confusion anymore, but a sudden, horrible clarity. They realized they'd been fed one story and I'd been fed another, and both of those conflicting stories came from the exact same person. We didn't ask for any paperwork beyond what she told us, Arthur admitted quietly. She said it was an emergency. Orch. We believed her. I understood. If it were my child, I'd have done the exact same thing. No questions asked, handing over the money before any doubt could creep in. That wasn't foolishness. That was just how parents love. But love couldn't explain why a woman would tell her parents the business was dying, while telling her husband's mother that it was saved. Orch. It didn't explain why a wife would test her husband's obedience over potato salad. It didn't explain the torn note warning him not to tell his mother. And it certainly didn't explain why a grown man's hands would shake like that on his own porch. I think, I said slowly, my voice trembling, your daughter has been lying to all of us. She used different lies to keep us from talking to each other. Orch. A complicated mix of grief, denial, and a mother's desperate hope showed on Eleanor's face. I knew that look because I'd worn it myself, refusing to believe my own child could do something awful. Let me talk to her, Eleanor finally said, her voice quiet but determined, though her hands were still gripped tight in her lap. Mother to daughter. Orch. There are things she'll tell me that she won't tell you. I wanted to warn her that it probably wouldn't go the way she hoped, but I kept quiet. I just nodded. Because sometimes a mother has to see the truth for herself before she can truly believe it. 3 weeks have passed since I sat in that kitchen with Arthur and Eleanor. In those 21 long days, my son hasn't called me once. Orch. No Sunday call, no quick text to see how I'm doing, nothing. I've sent him a few cautious texts every few days, careful not to upset whatever fragile piece is left. Every time I get the same short reply hours later. All good, Mom. Just busy. The kind of text someone sends when they're desperate to convince you everything is fine, but they can't think of a single good thing to actually say. Orch. Eleanor has called me twice. Each time her voice sounded more tired than the last. She said Isabella was getting increasingly frustrated on the phone, dodging her questions. Every time Eleanor tried to bring up the loan or Danny, Isabella would change the subject. She won't let me get near it, Eleanor said during the last call, her usual poise cracking. Orch. Every time I bring it up, she finds an excuse to hang up. I don't know what's happening inside that house. I want to be honest about that. Because I've learned that pretending to see things you don't only makes the truth harder to believe later. I wasn't there. I didn't see it. All I have is the silence. And the silence from my son is the loudest thing of all. Orch. Until this Tuesday evening, when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize popped up. A local Pennsylvania area code, but not in my contacts. I almost let it go to voicemail. But some mother's instinct told me to swipe answer. Mom. That single word was all he said. But before he could even utter a second one, I knew everything had completely shifted. Orch. There was a chilling rawness in his voice, thin, brittle, and stretched to the limit, like someone clinging to a fraying rope with both hands, watching it finally slip through his fingers. Danny? Whose phone is this? Uncle Bobby's. I had to borrow it. A shaky breath came through the line. Isabella took my phone about 2 weeks ago. She said, She said I couldn't be trusted. She said, Orch. He paused, and I could clearly hear him swallow hard. She said I'm not allowed to see you anymore. No calling you, no visiting, nothing. She claims it's for our own good, just until things blow over. What about your work phone, sweetheart? The one for your contracting business? She cut that one off too. She called the carrier, claimed the line was stolen, and had it completely shut down. Orch. She told me she'd handle getting me a new number once everything settles. He let out a short, hollow sound, a terrible attempt at a laugh that hurt worse than crying. Right now, I have to grab whatever phone I can get my hands on when nobody's looking. Orch. I sank heavily onto my living room sofa, pressing one hand hard against my chest, as if that physical pressure was the only thing keeping my heart from beating right out of my chest. What does she mean by until things blow over, honey? What are you actually going to do? I can't. His voice completely shattered. I can't talk about it yet, Mom. Orch, I swear to God I want to tell you, but I need you to trust me just a little bit longer. Please. Lord knows, every single fiber of my being was screaming for answers right then. I sat there gripping the phone, like he would vanish into thin air if I let go. But that please brought me right back down to reality. Orch, that wasn't a man begging for time to stall. That was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, desperately weighing whether or not to jump. I trust you, I said, taking a deep breath and forcing down the questions, even though trust was the furthest thing from what I actually felt. I'm right here, Danny. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. He went quiet for a second. Orch, and in that heavy silence I felt a shift. Something solid was beginning to form beneath his terrified breathing. I think I'm getting ready to make a move. His voice came through so soft I could barely hear it. I don't know if I'm brave enough yet. Before I could ask what kind of move he meant, the line went dead. Orch. 4 days after that borrowed phone call, Danny showed up on my doorstep. Unannounced, just like I had done at his house weeks before. At first, I could barely read the expression on his face. It wasn't the blank, practiced coldness from his front porch, nor was it the raw panic from the phone. It was something more steady. Orch. For the first time in months, he looked like a man who had finally made up his mind rather than a target driven entirely by fear. I didn't ask a single question. I just stepped aside and let him in. I poured him a cup of coffee that he didn't even touch. I sat down and quietly waited for him to speak. Orch. I did something, he said, sitting at my worn kitchen table, his hands wrapped tight around the mug, like it was the only thing anchoring him to the chair. Something Isabella doesn't know about yet. Tell me. He took a deep breath, so long that I worried he was going to change his mind and bury it all over again. About 2 weeks ago, I went behind her back and saw a lawyer. Orch. I snuck out during the day, told Isabella I had a job site to check out across the county line. I drove my old pickup. Didn't want anyone driving me so I wouldn't have to explain where I was going. A lawyer? I repeated cautiously, keeping my voice perfectly level so I wouldn't startle him into stopping. A family law attorney named Barnaby Odom. Arthur set it up. Orch. Actually, he and Eleanor quietly paid the retainer. They didn't want the money showing up on any statements Isabella could check. I didn't even know they were working behind the scenes until I walked into the firm and the receptionist told me everything was taken care of. I sat there, letting the words echo in my mind, feeling the tight muscles in my chest finally relax. Orch. Arthur and Eleanor were moving in the shadows, just like me. We were all working in the dark, trying to build an escape route for my son before anyone in that house noticed. What did the lawyer say? I asked. Danny's jaw tightened, and then the words came rushing out like a broken dam. He asked me about everything. Orch. The loan, how it was set up, what's been happening between me and Isabella. All the details. I told him things I've never said out loud to a single soul. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our conversation, his eyes showed that completely unguarded raw pain. I told him about the porch, Mom. I told him what I said to you. I told him I've hated myself every single day since. Orch. My throat tightened instantly, but I didn't let it stop me from listening. There would be plenty of time to cry over that pain later, but right now, my son needed me to be a rock. George, the lawyer said, Danny continued, a trace of strength finally returning to his voice, that if I can document this pattern, her controlling all the money, cutting off my phone, keeping me from seeing you, it will be crucial evidence once we get to court. George, he said. Judges take things like financial abuse and forced isolation incredibly seriously in divorce cases, especially when this much money is involved. He told me I have far more options than I ever thought. He spoke those words softly, like he couldn't quite believe them himself. To a man who had been controlled for a whole year, hope felt like a completely foreign language. George. For a solid year, I thought there was no way out unless I walked away from everything I worked so hard to build, he said, staring at the cold coffee. This is the first time someone laid it out clearly and told me exactly what I can do. I reached across the table and clamped my hand tight over his. For a moment, neither of us said a word. George. But sitting there, watching my son hold onto that fragile piece of hope like it might slip away if he squeezed too hard, I knew everything had changed. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. 10 days after he sat at my table telling me about the lawyer, Danny called to ask if he could come over tonight. His voice was different this time. George. Steadier, like a man who had stopped pacing by the edge of the water and finally waded into the deep end. He arrived just as darkness fell. Before he even sat down, he spoke. I filed today, Mom. The divorce papers. Barnaby got everything through this morning. I felt a sharp contraction in my chest, followed by total release. George, relief and fear were so tangled up together, I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Sit down, I said. Tell me everything. From the beginning. All the details, don't leave anything out. So, he laid it all out on the table. He started with the crisis in the business. Things had gotten so bad he had to watch the contracting company he built from scratch edge toward bankruptcy. George. He told me how ashamed he felt, like he hadn't stepped up the way a real man should, which was why he was too proud to come to me. He told me he initially went to Isabella to talk it through. Not because he preferred her, but because he thought a wife might understand that kind of male pride better than his mother. George. He explained how she went behind his back to beg her parents, returning with the loan offer like a savior. In that moment, he was so overwhelmed with gratitude he never even questioned the true cost of that money. And then there was the robbery, he said, his voice going completely flat and guarded, like a man walking on thin ice. George. What robbery? I pressed, even though my gut had been circling that word ever since Eleanor let it slip in her kitchen. He told me about the first payment. It was a massive installment, all in cash. Isabella had insisted he deliver the cash directly to her parents' house instead of doing a bank wire. George. She told him that delivering it in person would mean the world to them. A sign of respect, the proper gesture after everything they'd done. She picked the night, and she mapped out the route. She told him arriving right after Arthur's usual Thursday family dinner would be much more appropriate than just dropping by anytime. George. She even made him park 2 blocks away, claiming that parking his truck too close would look like he didn't trust the security of their high-end neighborhood. During that 2-block walk, in what looked like a perfectly staged street robbery, the money vanished. She told me we absolutely couldn't make a scene. His voice started to shake. No calling the police, no telling her family. George. She said if I did, it would just look like I kept the money for myself, or lost it and made up a story to cover it up. I should have told you all of this a year ago. His eyes welled up, his voice growing raspy. I was just so humiliated, and once the lies started, I didn't know how to stop them without watching everything completely fall apart. George. I let the silence hang in the kitchen for a moment before responding. He needed to feel the weight of a whole year of lies, rather than having it brushed away with cheap comfort. You let me stand on your porch, thinking I had done something terrible to be thrown out like that. I looked him straight in the eye. A year of silence, Danny. Orch. Letting your mother spend countless nights wondering what she did wrong. That is a very long time. I know. He didn't defend himself. He just took the guilt head on. But I wasn't just sitting around either. I sighed, finally showing my hand. I've been to see Arthur and Eleanor more than once. His head snapped up, completely shocked. What? Orch. A few weeks ago, I found a torn note in your jacket. I took it straight to them. We've been putting the broken pieces together on our end, just like you've been doing on yours. I reached out, placing my hand flat on the table between us, palm down, steady as could be. You have a lot more support than you think, sweetheart. Do her parents know I filed? Orch. They will, I looked at him. And when this hits the courtroom, you won't be standing next to Barnaby alone. The hallways of the Pennsylvania County Courthouse always smells like a mix of stale coffee and old carpet. I sat in the second row of the gallery, hands clamped tight in my lap, my knuckles aching from the pressure. Before we arrived, Barnaby had explained the purpose of this hearing. Orch. In family law, it's called a temporary orders hearing. The judge decides how to handle the marital accounts and business assets while the divorce moves forward. Who gets access to what money and whose name stays on what debt until a final settlement is reached. Orch. Sitting here, watching my son and his attorney side by side at the heavy plaintiff's table, I knew this was the first time a whole year of lies was being laid out in a room designed specifically to measure the truth. Isabella sat on the other side of the aisle. She looked completely polished, with immaculate makeup and a calm demeanor that felt much more rehearsed than genuine. Orch. She didn't look at Danny once. She didn't look at her parents either, even though Arthur and Eleanor were sitting directly behind her defense attorney, close enough to touch her if they wanted to. When Barnaby called Eleanor to the stand, I watched her slowly walk up to the witness box. Orch. She looked even smaller than she did in her own kitchen, as if the weight of what she was about to do had physically drained some of her life force. Barnaby kept his questioning completely flat and objective, guiding her through the facts. It was she and Arthur who provided the near $1 million loan, wired directly into an account managed solely by Isabella. Orch. It was Isabella who told them the money was an absolute emergency. From then on, it was Isabella who controlled all communication regarding the funds, actively keeping Eleanor from speaking to Danny about it. She told us Danny was proud, Eleanor said, gripping the railing of the witness box, her voice echoing in the quiet courtroom. Orch. She said he didn't want it discussed openly, that it would humiliate him if we made a big deal out of it. She paused, her eyes rimmed with red. We believed her. We wanted to believe her. And how does this relate to the matter before the court today? Barnaby asked. Because that loan is at the center of everything, Eleanor said, looking directly at the judge. Orch. Because nobody truly knows where that money went or how it was handled except Isabella. I believe the court needs to understand that before deciding who carries what debt. Then, the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination. Before he even spoke, I felt my muscles tighten. Mrs. Orch. Marsh, the lawyer in the expensive suit said aggressively, isn't it true that you're testifying against your own daughter today simply because you're angry about a missed payment? You're siding with Mr. Blackwood out of resentment, not out of any real concern for the truth. Isn't that right? Eleanor's chin came up just a fraction. Orch. Even though her eyes were wet, something incredibly tough took hold inside her. I am angry, she said without backing down. I won't pretend I'm not. But I'm not sitting here to punish my daughter. I'm sitting here because the court asked me what I know about that loan, and I intend to answer honestly, regardless of what it costs me or her. A dead silence fell over the courtroom. Orch. It was the heavy kind of quiet that presses down on you, not a peaceful one. I turned to look at Isabella. For the first time since this whole storm started, I saw a crack in her armor. Her jaw was clamped tight, her gaze locked onto a single spot on the table in front of her, Her hands twisted together so hard, her knuckles were completely white. For just a split second, she looked like a woman watching the walls she carefully built begin to crumble under the weight of the testimony. For the first time in a very long time, Isabella looked panicked. 3 weeks after that initial hearing, we found ourselves sitting together again. Only this time, it was in a private mediation room instead of a courtroom. A long conference table, soft recessed lighting, the standard setup for a modern law firm, designed to make brutal negotiations look a little more civilized than they actually are. Barnaby had warned us to expect games or hostility given the tension at the first hearing. Instead, the reaction we got caught everyone off guard. Isabella walked in looking perfectly composed. Her hair was immaculate, her outfit completely proper, looking like she was attending a casual dinner party, rather than the dismantling of her marriage. She gave a slight nod to her lawyer and sat down right across from Danny. The tension that had tight-flipped her features in court weeks ago was completely gone. "I don't want to drag this out," she said shortly after the meeting started, her voice sounding incredibly reasonable. "I think we can reach terms that are fair to everyone. I have no interest in punishing anyone. I just want this over with quickly." I watched Danny's shoulders, which had been tense since we walked into the building, relax slightly at her words. I felt something similar loosen in my own chest. Even though I knew how good this woman was at shifting masks to say exactly what the room wanted to hear, a cautious trace of hope started to spread anyway. For nearly an hour, the negotiation went smoother than any of us anticipated. She didn't fight the terms on the house, giving it up immediately. When Barnaby brought out the language, stating that the massive loan debt would remain solely her responsibility moving forward, she didn't fight that either. At one point, she looked Danny right in the eye, her voice dropping into a low tone that was almost tender. "I know I made things harder than they needed to be. I'm sorry for that, at least." I sat there watching her say it, and the tired old mother in me wanted so badly to believe her. But the other part of me, the part that had grown sharp after a year of lies, leaned back and stared at her hands, which remained perfectly still on the table throughout the entire meeting. Eleanor noticed too. I caught her looking at her daughter, and it wasn't a look of relief. It was the look of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. Near the end of the session, as the lawyers were finalizing the legal language, a clerk slipped into the room and placed a thin envelope in front of Barnaby. These were the bank records for the loan account he had subpoenaed weeks ago, finally unsealed and delivered today. Barnaby didn't open it right then. He just thanked the clerk and slid it to the side. I didn't think much of it until the meeting wrapped up. Once it was over, everyone stood exchanging that stiff, fake courtesy unique to legal battles. Isabella left the room first, her lawyer right behind her. Then I saw Barnaby pull Danny aside near the elevators. He had the envelope open now. His voice was low and urgent, completely out of sync with the peace we had just left behind in the conference room. I only caught a few fragments. Something about massive transfers out of the loan account into a second account. One, none of us recognized, in the days right around the robbery. He also mentioned phone records he'd pulled along with the statements. A specific number had been dialed heavily during that exact same window. "This doesn't match her timeline at all," I heard Barnaby say, tapping the folder. "Before we take the next step, I need to find out exactly who this phone number belongs to." Danny's face, which had been relatively calm minutes ago, tightened right back up. The piece we had just been handed in that room didn't even survive the walk to the elevator. Barnaby had warned us that tracking down and reviewing those hidden records could take weeks. But it took less than 10 days for him to call Danny. There was an excitement in his voice I hadn't heard before, a highly controlled excitement that only a professional lawyer allows himself when he's nearly 100% certain he's found the smoking gun. The next hearing came quickly. I sat in my usual spot in the gallery, watching Barnaby stand up with a folder thick enough that I could feel its weight from yards away. Porch. Your Honor, he said clearly, we ask to submit into evidence a series of financial records for accounts tied to the loan funds, as well as the corresponding phone records from that same period. Isabella's lawyer jumped up instantly to object, using typical procedural arguments about relevance. But the judge waved it off, allowing the submission. Porch. Barnaby began walking the court through the evidence. He explained that shortly after the loan money landed in the account Isabella managed, several large transfers were moved into a second account. One, Danny had previously testified he had never seen and knew nothing about. Then, Barnaby turned his attention to the phone logs. In the days immediately surrounding the alleged robbery, Mrs. Porch. Isabella Blackwood's phone shows heavy call and text activity with a number completely absent from the family's regular contacts, 6 contacts in a 4-day span. And then, after that date, the communication stops completely. The courtroom was dead quiet. Porch. And that phone number? Barnaby's voice filled the room. According to our cross-reference of the records request, belongs to an individual with a documented criminal record. An individual who was later identified by police as an associate of the suspect in the street robbery that night. I sat perfectly still, listening to the facts pile up like bricks, each one heavier than the last. Porch. I thought about Danny hesitating over 60 cents at the convenience store while his wife was quietly moving fortunes and setting up a robbery against him. My hands turned cold in my lap. Finally, Barnaby brought up the hotel records. It wasn't even the core evidence, just a sarcastic footnote to the whole thing. Porch. During the very weeks Isabella was claiming their finances were strapped, her credit cards were lighting up with high-end charges. Your Honor, we are not here to make final determinations today, Barnaby said with careful precision, though the edge in his voice was clear. We simply ask the court to note the pattern. Porch. The transfers, the heavy contact on key dates, and the direct link to the robbery itself. We believe Mrs. Blackwood should be required to address these issues directly. I looked across the aisle at Isabella. She sat completely rigid, her hands crossed so tight on the table in front of her. She stared straight ahead, as if refusing to look at the numbers would make them disappear. Porch. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something. She gave a tiny nod, her jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle twitching under her skin. Before the judge could move to the next item, Barnaby stood again. Your Honor, given the evidence just presented, we request to recall Mrs. Blackwood to the stand for further cross-examination. The judge looked at the clock on the wall and nodded. Granted. Porch. We will reconvene on Thursday. As the gavel hit the block, I looked at Isabella's face. For the first time since I've known her, she looked like a woman who knew she was completely out of options. No amount of polish was going to stop what was coming. Thursday came slow, and then all at once. Those kinds of days always do. Porch. I sat in the same spot in the gallery, only this time, Eleanor sat next to me instead of behind her daughter. That small shift in seating spoke volumes about where the loyalty in that family now lay. Isabella took the stand again. She maintained her composure on the surface, but I could see what it was costing her now. Porch. The tight line of her shoulders, the way her thumb dug into the palm of her hand, it all gave away the panic. Barnaby started slow and methodical. He walked her back through the transfers and the phone number from the previous hearing. She answered carefully, her explanation sounding completely rehearsed. Porch. The money was hers to move. The calls were about a private matter she preferred not to discuss. Barnaby let her talk, letting her get completely comfortable in her version of the story. Then, once she relaxed, he brought it right back to the robbery. Mrs. Blackwood, your husband testified earlier in these proceedings that he was robbed while walking down Cardigan Street. Porch. Does that match your understanding of that evening? I've already answered questions about that night, she said, a sharp edge finally breaking into her voice. I don't control what street Danny chooses to walk down. I didn't ask if you controlled his route. Barnaby pressed, stepping closer. I asked if that was your understanding of where he was. Orch. Of course it was Cardigan Street, she snapped, her patience completely evaporating. That wasn't even. He wasn't even supposed to be robbed on Cardigan Street. That was never the plan. She stopped dead. The words hung in the air for half a second before her own expression caught up with what she had just said. I watched her hand fly to her mouth. Too late. The word was out. Orch. A dead silence fell over the room. An absolute, chilling quiet. I felt Eleanor's hand grip my arm so tight it was bound to leave a bruise. Behind us, Arthur let out a low sound. A small grunt like a wounded animal. I'll remember that sound for the rest of my life. Barnaby didn't push. He just let the silence sit there. Let the weight of what she just said settle into the room. Orch. Because nothing else needed to be said. A woman who was supposed to only know what she'd been told, a woman who was supposed to only know Danny was robbed on Cardigan Street, had just corrected the location of where the robbery should have happened. The only way she could know that detail was if she knew exactly where it was planned to take place. Orch. Her own defense attorney sat completely frozen next to her, his pen hovering over his legal pad, motionless. Your Honor, Barnaby said softly, breaking the cold quiet. I have no further questions for this witness. The judge looked at Isabella for a long time, a look passing over his face that I couldn't quite read. Then he turned to the room. Orch. We are in recess, he said, bringing the gavel down hard. 15 minutes, counsel, in my chambers before we reconvene. Isabella sat frozen in the box, her hand still over her mouth, staring blankly at the quiet room, a silence that felt heavier than any sentence a judge could ever hand down. 6 weeks after that recess, we were back in the same courtroom for the final settlement hearing. Orch. This time, nobody's hands were shaking but mine. The judge read through the terms of the settlement in a flat, businesslike tone. That classic American judicial voice that makes life-altering changes sound like a spreadsheet. The house went entirely to Danny. Orch. The agreement forced Isabella to take on the remaining balance of the family loan, completely freeing Danny from the debt. Meaning whatever consequences came from that money moving forward belonged to her alone. On top of that, the judge read off a restitution figure, and Eleanor let out a long breath next to me, like she'd been holding it for months. Isabella sat with a completely new lawyer. Orch. Her original attorney had quietly withdrawn shortly after that Thursday appearance. She didn't look at any of us during the entire proceeding. When the judge asked if she understood the terms, she said, "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice sounded completely hollowed out. It was the last thing I heard her say in that building. Orch. Days ago, Barnaby had told us privately that the record from that hearing, the transfers, the number, and that slip on the stand, had been forwarded to investigators at the district attorney's office after the judge made a referral. He was cautious, telling us a separate criminal investigation was now underway, completely distinct from what happened in this family court. Orch. He told us not to dig for information. I've learned that when the people who know what they're doing start digging, you let them dig. Whatever happens with that investigation will happen on its own timeline. It wasn't our problem anymore. Outside on the wide granite steps of the courthouse, Arthur shook Danny's hand. It lasted much longer than a regular handshake. Orch. You're still family to us, Arthur said, his voice a little raspy. Whatever she did, it doesn't change 30 years of knowing who you are. You're a good man, Danny. Eleanor hugged me before she hugged her former son-in-law, her arms wrapping tight around my shoulders. Thank you, she whispered in my ear. Thank you for not letting go of the truth, and for not just assuming the worst of us. Orch. We found it together, I told her, and I meant it. That Sunday, Danny came over to my house at exactly 7 in the evening. Just like he used to do all those years before everything broke. When I opened the door, he was standing there holding a takeout bag from the Chinese place we always used to go to for my birthdays. Back before there was any reason for either of us to doubt the other. Orch. I thought maybe we could bring this back, he said, holding up the bag with a slight boyish grin. I didn't say a word, I just stepped aside and let him in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he had broken down weeks ago, and ate our dinner in a quiet that didn't feel heavy anymore. Halfway through the meal, he looked up at me. "I still think about the porch," he said. "Porch. I don't think I'll ever stop being sorry for that." "I know," I looked at him. "But you came back. That's the part I'm choosing to remember." He gave a slow nod, letting himself believe it was actually allowed. I looked at my son sitting there fully present, looking more like himself than he had in over a year. I thought about every painful step it took to get here. Porch. None of it changed what he did that morning on the porch. But it didn't matter. Some doors have to be shut hard just so a real one can finally open. He reached out and scooped another helping of rice onto his plate. It was the first time and I couldn't tell you how long that I watched my son eat a meal without hesitating, without wondering what it was going to cost him. Porch. Before the plate could even hit the table, a thick cloud of Marlboro smoke hit me right in the face. I froze for a second, holding the dinner I'd just finished cooking, watching my stepson take another long drag like he was sitting on his own private balcony. 2 weeks. That was the exact amount of time I'd spent in this suburban Texas house, in this marriage, in this family. Porch. And I was already learning that at an American dinner table, a suffocating silence can be louder than a shouting match. "Percy," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could, setting the plate of steak and mashed potatoes down in front of him instead of throwing it. "Could you not smoke while we're eating dinner?" It wasn't a huge request. Porch. I wasn't asking for much, just a little breathing room to enjoy a meal I'd made with my own hands. In a house I was working myself ragged to keep together, I was still trying to figure out which chair at this table actually belonged to me. My name is Siobhan Sheridan. I didn't grow up rich, but I grew up with pride. Porch. Long before I became anyone's wife, I had built a life for myself in this country with nothing but my own 2 hands. I never thought that in this marriage, my pride would be the very first thing put to the test. Not love, not money, just my dignity. Percy looked at me like I was something he'd already decided was a cheap piece of fiction. "Shut up, gold digger," he said, cold and certain. Porch. It sounded like a line he'd practiced 1,000 times in the mirror, ever since the day his father introduced me to him. "You're not my real mom anyway." A dead silence fell over the dining room. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. I looked at Rutherford, my husband. The man whose name was legally tied to mine. Porch. I was sitting in a house that belonged to him, and his son had just spoken to me like I was gum stuck to the bottom of his shoe. I waited half a second, maybe less, for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he just picked up his fork. He started eating. No correction. "No, you don't talk to her like that." He didn't even look over at me to acknowledge what had just happened. Porch. There was only the clink of silverware against ceramic. It was as if the words Percy threw at me had cut right through the room without touching either of them. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be honest about that. If this were a movie, I might have flipped the table, and maybe I should have. But that isn't who I am. That's not how I was raised. Porch. I quietly finished the food on my plate. After dinner, I cleared the table. I said goodnight like a woman who hadn't just been insulted in her own home. If you're listening to this, and you've ever sat at a table where nobody stood up for you, please tell me what that felt like. I just want to know who is out there with me tonight. Porch. But the moment I clicked off the kitchen light, something shifted inside me. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, colder. I thought about everything I'd done since the day I said, "I do" to this family. The peace I'd kept, the cracks I'd carefully smoothed over before they turned into wars. The weight I carried alone so no one else had to bear it. Nobody at that table knew the weight of it. Porch. Nobody had ever asked. Standing in that dark kitchen, I made a choice. A choice I didn't say out loud. I didn't tell Rutherford, I didn't tell Percy, and I didn't even put it into exact words in my own mind. I was done. I was done doing it quietly. The next morning, the sound of Rutherford's keys hitting the granite island was louder than usual. Porch. Before he even spoke, I knew things were going wrong between him and Percy again. In the hallway, they exchanged a sharp, tense look. That used to be my cue. For the 2 years I'd been in this family, through the dating, the engagement, long before I took his name, that look meant it was time for me to step in. I would always intervene before things broke down into an ugly argument. Porch. A well-timed joke to ease the tension, a question to redirect Percy's quick temper, a soft word of reassurance to Rutherford before his patience ran out. Nobody ever asked me to do it. I just did it by instinct. That morning, I stood by the stove with a spatula in my hand and let that tense look cut across the kitchen without taking a single step toward either of them. Porch. Percy grabbed his Carhartt jacket from the chair. "You still haven't fixed that Ford truck," he threw at his father, already halfway out the door. "I told you I'd get to it," Rutherford said, the irritation clear in his voice. I could hear the start of the usual mood that, if left alone, would grow teeth. Porch. Normally, I'd chime in with a light Texas drawl. "Hey, we haven't even had coffee yet, and you two are fighting over a truck?" I'd say something to make them both laugh instead of confront each other. I'd done it so many times I could practically feel the words on my tongue. But I didn't say it. I just flipped the eggs in the pan. Porch. I let the silence stretch out until Percy slammed the door behind him. Rutherford stood there for a second, his jaw tight, like a drowning man waiting for a rescue that never came. He glanced at me. Just a quick half-second look, but I saw the confusion deep in his eyes. He was confused by the sudden quiet, by the space I used to fill with softness that was now completely empty. Porch. He didn't ask me why. He never asked about things like that. He just took his black coffee and went to change for work. Standing at the stove, I realized how much of this house relied on things I did that nobody ever thanked me for. I remembered calling the loan officers for Rutherford because his credit score wasn't strong enough to handle a business negotiation. Porch. I remembered making the calls to smooth things over with angry clients when he messed up. I remembered every argument between him and his son that I absorbed like a bruise nobody else saw. Because if a bruise is seen, it means questions have to be answered. None of it had ever been acknowledged. Not once, not even with the smallest thank you. I wasn't looking for applause. Porch. I want to be clear about that. I never did it to be thanked. But there is a massive line between not needing a thank you and being told in your own home that you're only there for the money. By the time Rutherford left for work, the weight in the kitchen was far heavier than it should have been for what just happened. Porch. It was just an egg cooling in a pan, a truck that hadn't been fixed, a silence I used to fill that I was now letting grow. That night, when Rutherford got home and Percy was already at the table, I heard the familiar conflict start up again. The same tense tone, escalating quickly, but this time, there was nothing standing between them to cushion the blow. Porch. For the first time since I married into this family, I heard my husband and his son say things to each other that neither of them could ever take back. Aunt Vernell let herself in the way she always did, like the door owed her money. "I hear your two men are at it again," she said, dropping her designer purse onto my island without asking. Porch. Her eyes moved over me, sizing me up the way she always did when deciding whether to trust someone. I didn't ask who told her. In this blue-collar Texas neighborhood, in this family, news travels faster than the wind whether you want it to or not. "Percy and Rutherford had a few words," I said. "Not me." She slowed down her speech, chewing on the words before deciding to believe them. Porch. You're awfully calm for a woman who just got called some terrible names at her own dinner table. I kept folding the dish towel in my hands. "What do you think I should do, Vernell? I don't know." She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter, watching me like a puzzle she'd already solved halfway in her head. "It just feels like you've stopped fighting for anything lately. Porch. Even for yourself." I didn't answer right away, watching her take the silence exactly how I expected. As a warning sign rather than just exhaustion. Are you sure you're not just waiting for something? She tilted her head slightly, keeping the words soft. Because to me, you got quiet awfully fast. For someone who spent 2 years marrying into this estate. I met her eyes without blinking. Orch. I don't have to prove anything to you. I didn't say you did. She picked up her bag, looking like she'd gotten what she came for. I'm just saying, a quiet woman makes people nervous, Shioban. Especially a woman who used to have a lot to say and suddenly doesn't. She left the same way she came in, without waiting for me to show her out. Orch. After the door shut, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, thinking about what she said. A quiet woman makes people nervous. Maybe she was right, even if it wasn't for the reasons she thought. I wasn't plotting or waiting to strike back. I was just tired of carrying things. Nobody noticed I was carrying. Orch. And I couldn't even say that out loud because the moment I did, it would sound exactly like the accusation she was already making. I didn't defend myself. Not because I didn't have the words. I had plenty. I just stood there realizing that explaining myself to Vernell meant explaining myself to everyone. And I wasn't ready to give my reasons to a room that hadn't earned them. Orch. Long after Vernell left that night, the house went back to its usual heavy silence. On my way to the bedroom, I passed Rutherford's study. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see him hunched over his wide oak desk. The lamp was turned down low, and he was reviewing something on his laptop with a quiet intensity that belonged to a man who desperately didn't want to be caught. Orch. He wasn't looking at the logistics invoices he usually left lying around the kitchen table. This was different. He was being careful, deliberate, keeping the screen angled away from the door. I didn't ask what he was looking at. I didn't linger long enough for him to catch me watching. But I noticed. Orch. As I walked away from that door, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever he was looking up, he didn't want me to see it. That meant for the first time since this marriage began, my husband was actively hiding something from me. A few days later, I found Percy standing in the doorway of Rutherford's study, stiff as a board, holding a folded piece of paper in his hands, trembling slightly. Orch. What is this? He asked before I could even set down my coffee mug. He held the paper out toward me like a piece of evidence he'd already used to convict me in his mind. Why is your name on a financial document with numbers this high? These aren't numbers a housewife should have. What are you doing behind his back? Percy, what are you doing in your father's study? His jaw tightened. Orch. The shop called about the truck trade-in, and he told me to find the title, he said coldly. It wasn't in the file drawer where he said it was. So I went through the folders on his desk and this was underneath. I looked at the paper without taking it from his hand. I recognized it. It was an old bank statement, months old. Orch. A piece of confidential business that should have been locked away, left out in a folder where anyone helping out could stumble across it. That's not your business, Percy. It doesn't matter whose business it is now. His voice shook slightly, a mix of accusation and some deep, raw fear underneath. Orch. The point is, on a commercial document with this much money involved, my father's name should be first. But it isn't. Yours is. I felt that old instinct rise up inside me, the urge to explain, to soften the blow, to make it easier for him to understand. But I let it pass through me and fade away, just like I'd been letting everything pass through me lately. Orch. Ask your father, I said quietly, turning to leave the doorway. I'm asking you. And I heard you. Rutherford appeared behind him right then, just coming in from outside with his keys in hand. His eyes moved quickly between the paper, my face, and his son, reading the room a step slower than normal as usual. What's going on? He asked, though his tone told me he already knew. Orch. Why does she have documents like this? Percy demanded, pushing the statement toward his father this time instead of me. Money is moving around, and her name is all over it. You know what this looks like, Dad? It looks like she's building an escape route. Moving money where you can't touch it, getting ready to take whatever she can and disappear before anyone notices. Orch. The accusation hit me square in the chest. Not because it was true, but because it was so completely backwards. I almost wanted to laugh. He thought I was hiding money from Rutherford. He thought it was a betrayal in progress, not realizing it was a rescue that had been completed 2 years ago. Rutherford took the paper from Percy, glanced at it, and folded it back up quickly, refusing to look closer. "It's not what you think," he said, keeping his voice low. "Just drop it. It's complicated business paperwork. Don't worry about it." That was his entire explanation. No clarity, no defense for me, not even the smallest correction. Just a casual "don't worry about it." The exact same tone he used when dealing with a broken microwave. Percy's jaw set even harder, and I watched something settle deep in his eyes. It wasn't doubt, it was certainty. The confusion he'd walked into the room with had hardened completely into conviction. His father's vague dismissal hadn't cleared anything up. It had just added fuel to the fire. "Complicated business paperwork," Percy repeated, like the phrase itself was proof of a cover-up. "Yeah, I bet." He folded the statement back up and tucked it into his jacket pocket, not leaving it on the desk. Then, he walked right past both of us toward the front door without another word. After he left, I stood in that room for a long time. With a cold, strange clarity, I realized one thing. Percy had made a complete misjudgment, and he was going to go out of his way to prove exactly how right, or wrong, he was. On Tuesday afternoon, I watched Percy walk out the front door. His pace was much slower than usual, hands shoved in his pockets, heading straight toward Mr. Dunlap's house 2 doors down instead of his usual spots when he needed space. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mr. Dunlap worked at the Chase branch downtown and had lived there since before I moved in. He was a classic Southern neighbor, the kind who would keep you on the porch, talking about the Dallas Cowboys for an hour if you let him. Percy had known him his whole life. A young man stopping to talk to an old neighbor wasn't strange. It wasn't until later that evening, as I was folding laundry by the hallway window, that I noticed Percy walking back even slower. His jaw was clenched tight, eyes fixed on a point nowhere in front of him. It was the face people make when they are chewing on a truth they absolutely despise. I didn't ask him what was wrong. He wouldn't have told me if I did. The truth came to me almost by accident late that night. It was Rutherford's voice, low and muffled, coming from the study. Vernell had let herself in after dinner without me noticing. "She's too quiet, Rutherford. Ever since that dinner. You don't think it's strange?" I stopped in the hallway, the laundry basket pressed against my hip. I told myself not to listen, but I did anyway. "She's just processing," Rutherford said. I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the sound of a man reciting lines he only half believed himself. "Processing?" Vernell's voice had that edge I'd heard in the kitchen. "Or waiting. There's a difference, and you know it. I'm not saying she's a bad woman. I'm saying I don't trust the quiet." Rutherford didn't answer right away. The silence stretched so long I almost walked away, almost let the moment go without hearing anything else. "There's a lot about this marriage you don't know," he finally said, his voice so quiet I almost missed it. Things I probably should have told Percy a long time ago." My chest tightened at that. It wasn't fear. It was a strange sense of validation. That was the voice of a man standing on the edge of a secret he'd carried alone for 2 years. "Then tell him," Vernell said. "It's not that simple, Vernell." His voice snapped up, carrying that sharp irritation he used when he wanted to end a conversation rather than face it. Then it dropped back down, almost to himself. "He's already thinking the worst of her. If I tell him the rest of it now, God knows what he'll do." I heard Vernell let out a long breath, the sound of a woman deciding not to push any further tonight. "Suit yourself," she said. "But secrets don't stay buried easy in a house this small." I moved away before they could come out. My heart was beating with a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't pure hope, and it wasn't pure fear. Rutherford knew the ice was cracking, and he was closer to saying the truth out loud than he had been in 2 years of silence. But close isn't the same as doing it. Standing in the dim kitchen with a basket of towels I didn't remember carrying, I realized one thing clearly. Whatever truth my husband was holding on to, he still wasn't ready to let go of it. And Percy and Vernell weren't anywhere near close enough to stop the storms that was coming. The next evening, I found myself in the hallway again. This time, I didn't pretend I wasn't listening. Rutherford had called Percy into the study. Through the half-open door I could see they were both standing, not sitting. That told me everything before they even spoke. In this family, the men never sat down when a conversation actually mattered. They stood up, as if sitting would make the reality too heavy to face. "You've been asking around," Rutherford said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Percy crossed his arms tighter. Somebody had to figure out. Figure out what? To protect you. Percy's voice cracked slightly on the word you. Standing in the dark hallway, it hit me. Underneath all that certainty was still a boy afraid of losing his father, facing a crisis he didn't understand. Rutherford went quiet for a long time. I watched his shoulders rise and fall once, twice, a deep breath, before taking on a heavy load. "About how we kept this house," he started, his voice slowing down, picking his words carefully about the business recovery. "Things I never explained to you because—" He paused. I held my breath, the towel slipping from my hand without me noticing, waiting for the rest of it to drop. Because what did Percy say? Rutherford's jaw twitched once, twice, and then I watched 2 years of silence win the battle completely. It was like a crack in the foundation. No matter how much you patch it, the water always finds the same way in. "Because it wasn't the time," he changed his line. "Not now. Not while you're looking at me like I'm a criminal." "Dad? Drop it, Percy." "Not now." His voice carried that sharp irritation I'd heard through the wall the night before. The sound of a man shutting the door on himself and his son. "Just let it go, please." Percy stood there for a second, looking at his father's face, searching for something he couldn't find. Then, he gave a quick, sharp shake of his head and walked right past him out of the room. I backed away before they could see me. My chest felt tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't surprise. I hadn't really expected Rutherford to tell the truth. The moment I heard that hesitation in his voice, a part of me knew he would pull back right at the edge. What I felt was something quieter, colder. It was confirmation. My husband knew exactly what was happening in this house. He knew it all, and he chose comfort over honesty, choosing to keep the lie going rather than win back his son's trust. I didn't confront him that night. I wasn't ready for him to know how much I'd heard, or how well I understood the man I married. I went to bed like usual, letting him think whatever he needed to think about the quiet. 2 mornings later, I was sorting through the mail at the kitchen island when I found a thick envelope with Fontenot Logistics printed across the top. Our names were formally typed in the upper corner, right above words I didn't need to open the envelope to understand. Contract renewal. Urgent response required. I set it on the counter. Unopened, my hand flat against the paper. Sitting there in the morning light, I knew one thing. Whatever fragile foundation this house had been built on, the bill was finally coming due. Whether any of us were ready for it or not. Later that evening, Rutherford found the envelope sitting exactly where I'd left it on the counter. I watched his face from the doorway as he read it. He had that look he always got when business numbers made him feel out of control. Not calm, just completely frozen. "You saw this?" he asked without looking up, his voice tight. "I saw the envelope. I didn't open it." He read it again, as if reading it one more time would change what was written on the page. "They want a response in 3 weeks. A full audit of the terms, renegotiating the renewal." He slapped the envelope down on the table a little harder than necessary. 3 weeks. I didn't say anything. I picked up a glass that was already dry and kept rubbing it with the towel, just giving my hands something to do while I waited for his reaction. "It's fine," he said, mostly to himself. "I'll handle it." I didn't ask how. In 2 years, I'd learned enough about my husband to know that when he said, "I'll handle it," in that specific tone. It meant he was standing on a ledge he didn't understand, desperately trying to talk himself into feeling safe. It took 2 whole days before he brought it up again. I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Porch. 3 lines were written down, then scratched out heavily. His iPhone was sitting face down next to it, like he'd tried to call someone and changed his mind. "Have you eaten?" I set a plate down near his hand, not hungry. He kept his eyes on the pad, not looking up. "The people at Fontenot want an in-person meeting. Porch. A full review of operations, financial standing, payment terms, and to see if our partnership still aligns with their long-term value." He chewed on the last words like sand. "I don't even know half this Wall Street nonsense." "You built a good relationship with Delroy Fontenot," I said, picking my words carefully. "That still carries weight." Porch. "And the business is steadier than it used to be. Local contracts, the 2 new drivers you took on last year. That's real work you did yourself." "Maybe." Rutherford rubbed his face hard. "But Fontenot is still our lifeline. We lose them, we can't even keep the lights on. This is different." Porch. "They're bringing lawyers and executives who speak in circles, and they're going to expect you to run at their pace." I didn't offer any more advice. I wanted to help him. That old instinct was right there, pushing me to say, "I can call him for you. I can sit down with you and go through the terms line by line." But I caught the words before they could leave my mouth. He hadn't asked me to. Porch. For 2 years, I'd stepped in to fix things before anyone even had to ask. But today, standing there with a dish towel in my hand, I realized something. This time he had to be the one to reach out first. So, I let the silence sit. I turned around to boil some water. I gave him the space to be alone with his panic, even if it wasn't easy to watch him sit there drowning in it. Porch. It took nearly 10 minutes before he spoke again. When he did, the irritation was gone. It wasn't soft, just entirely tired. The kind of tired that comes when a man has spent too long running from something he can't avoid. "Do you still?" He started, stopped, and tried again. Porch. "I mean, you used to know people over at Fontenot." He was testing the ground carefully, like a man walking on thin ice, wondering if it would hold him. "Do you still have those contacts?" he asked, slower this time. I looked at him, waiting for the rest of it. I let him wait a beat longer than necessary. "I still have the contacts," I said. "That hasn't changed." Porch. The relief moved over his face so fast it looked like a drowning man grabbing a rope without checking to see if the other end was tied to anything solid. "So you'll make the call, speak to the renewal person, get things lined up before the meeting, iron out the details." "No." He froze. "No? Isn't that how this works?" Porch. I set the towel down, forcing myself to look at him with a directness I hadn't used in 2 years. I wasn't stepping into the background anymore, acting like the shadow that fixed everything quietly. "If I do this, it's not going to be a favor I handle quietly behind the scenes so you can walk into that room acting like you sorted it out all on your own." Porch. My voice was steady, leaving no room for negotiation. "I'm going into that room with you. My name isn't just going to be on the papers nobody looks at. It's going to be at that table. I'm not just a wife handling an errand. I'm part of the negotiation." Porch. A mix of emotions passed over his face. Pride taking a hit, the deep discomfort of realizing the ground had completely shifted under his feet when he thought it was a simple request. "That's not necessary, Shioban. I just need." "I heard what you need," I said, my tone even but sharp. "Those are my terms. Take it or handle it yourself." He didn't answer right away. Porch. He looked at the legal pad, at the messy lines scratched out, at the 3 weeks that were now less than 2. "Fine," he finally said, his voice dropping lower. "Fine, we go together." I gave a single nod and turned back to the counter. I felt an unexpected calmness in my chest. Porch. It wasn't the joy of winning, just the simple relief of finally saying my boundary out loud instead of carrying it quietly. Later that same evening, Vernell came over. Later than usual, carrying that anxious energy I knew well. She barely set her bag down before her phone rang. She stepped into the hallway to answer it. but she was close enough that the words came clear into the kitchen. Porch. Percy, slow down. What? She paused. No way, how could that be? Give me something real to go on, not just your gut. A statement with her name on it isn't proof of anything, Percy. Vernell's voice dropped lower. You said yourself you didn't even see the whole page. Another pause, a longer one this time. I hear you. Her tone changed, turning cautious. Porch. And I won't lie to you. I've thought something was off with this marriage since the wedding day. That's nothing new. But looking at half a torn document doesn't mean you know the truth. I stopped wiping the glass. My hands went completely still against the towel. I'm not telling you to let it slide, Vernell continued. Porch. I'm telling you not to make up a whole conspiracy based on one page you didn't even finish reading. Go find the rest of the puzzle. Get the whole picture, then come back to me. I stood in the kitchen for a long time, completely forgetting about the dish in my hand. It hit me that Vernell hadn't given Percy the validation he wanted. Instead, she'd pushed him to dig deeper. That left me even more uneasy, because now there was no gray area left and no hope that he'd just let it go. First came the sound of the filing cabinet. Then came Percy's voice. It was the metal screech of a drawer being yanked open by someone who had completely lost their patience and didn't care about making noise. I stood at the end of the hallway, the laundry basket forgotten at my feet, watching my stepson stand in his father's study. A document lay spread flat on the wide desk. This time he had searched with absolute purpose. It was no accident. Percy. Rutherford's sharp voice came from behind me. He had walked up the stairs without me hearing. He pushed past me, stepping right into the study doorway. What do you think you're doing? Percy didn't look up right away. He was reading the paper, his lips moving slightly, the way people do when the words are too to scan quickly. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, carrying a look I'd never seen on him before. It says here she put a personal guarantee on the commercial loan. His voice was flat, trembling with disbelief. $90,000. It wasn't, she didn't just sign her name. Her credit score, her personal assets. Everything was on the line. He looked at his father like he was looking at a stranger. This was before you two even got married, Dad. This was when the business was about to go under, and the bank was going to repossess the trucks? Rutherford didn't answer right away. I watched his shoulders do that familiar thing, rising up tense before dropping heavily like letting go of a massive burden. And this, Percy continued, flipping to another page, his voice rising. This is the referral letter to Fontenot Logistics. This email chain setting up the first meeting. It's all her. She ran the meetings, He stopped, swallowing hard. Without this contract, you wouldn't even have a logistics business to talk about. She built this whole thing. Not you. Percy, I thought she was moving money. Percy's voice completely cracked on the word, moving. For a second, he sounded younger than I'd ever seen him. Not like a 24-year-old man. I thought she was getting ready to run with the money after you went bankrupt. I told Aunt Vernell I thought she... He shook his head hard, as if trying to physically shake the wrong ideas out of his brain. It wasn't like that at all, was it? She never took anything from this family. She put her own name and $90,000 of her own money on the line just to save this place so we'd still have a home. Rutherford stood frozen in the doorway. And then, I watched the final defense inside him crumble. It wasn't a breakdown, just a surrender, like a dam that had held back far too much water for too long and finally let go. She never wanted anyone to know, he said quietly. She never wanted the credit. So I let it stay that way. I turned her modesty into a secret I kept from you. That was my mistake, not hers. 2 years, Dad. Percy's voice dropped to a whisper I could barely hear. 2 whole years. You let me treat her like some thief who was using you. And the truth is, she's the only reason you had enough dignity left to ask her to marry you. Rutherford didn't defend himself. He just nodded, like a defendant accepting a sentence he knew was coming all along. Before either of them could see me standing in the hallway, I quietly backed away. My chest was filled with an emotion too complicated to put into words. It was vindication mixed with a deep sadness, a sense of relief tangled up with a familiar old ache. Percy didn't come to see me that night. Later on, I heard his bedroom door click shut down the hall, soft but firm. Porch. I understood that he needed space to process the truth before facing me directly, and a tired part of me respected him for that. The next morning, Rutherford found me in the laundry room. Seeing him standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, I knew he was there to deliver a speech he'd been rehearsing. I told him, he said, everything. Porch. The guarantee, the Fontenot referral, all of it. I didn't stop folding the shirt in my hands. I know. His eyebrows went up slightly. You know, I heard enough, Rutherford, not that I was trying to snoop. I set the shirt down, finally looking him in the eye. 2 years, Siobhan. 2 years. You had 2 years to lay the truth on the table. Porch. All it would have taken was a tiny bit of courage, anytime you wanted. My voice was steady but cold, and in the end it only came out because your son dug through your files and forced your hand. He didn't try to argue. Porch. His jaw twitched, and for a second I thought he'd try to find an excuse. Something like, I did it to protect you, or I didn't want to make things harder. The usual lines men use when they really mean, I didn't want to deal with the hassle. But he just said, I know. I let that statement hang between us for a moment, refusing to soften it. Porch. I didn't want him to feel relieved before he'd actually earned forgiveness. Then I picked up the next shirt. Dwelling on his mistakes wasn't going to turn our 12-day deadline back into 3 weeks, and it wasn't going to solve the pressure from the Fontenot team. Does Percy want to talk to me? I asked. He didn't say. Rutherford rubbed the back of his neck. He's not. Porch. He's not angry with you. I don't think he's angry at all. He's just quiet. Processing. Then I'll let him process. I kept my hands busy with another shirt. When he's ready, he'll come to me. Pushing him will only do the opposite. Rutherford watched me for a moment as if expecting more of a reaction. Anger, maybe, or a sigh of relief. Some clear emotion he could respond to. Porch. But I didn't give him one. I had no interest in performing my feelings just to make him feel better. We still have to deal with Fontenot. I changed the subject. 12 days isn't much time. If I'm going into that meeting with you, we need to know exactly what they want before we sit down across from them. Right, he nodded, looking glad to return to a safer professional topic. Right. Porch. Absolutely. He turned to go get the paperwork. I stood alone in the quiet laundry room for a moment, waiting for the strong sense of victory that was supposed to come. After keeping this secret for 2 years, now that the truth was finally out, I didn't feel victorious. Just tired. Porch. A deep, focused fatigue, along with the clear realization that the hard parts, the upcoming negotiation, the tough terms, and whatever Percy did next, were still ahead of me, not behind me. Before I could leave the room, I heard Vernelle's car pull into the driveway. Much earlier than she usually visited. From the heavy slam of her car door, I knew this wasn't a friendly social call. Porch. Rutherford! She started calling out the moment she hit the foyer. Her voice tight, not waiting for an answer as she marched in. You need to explain some things to me. If what Percy told me last night is true, I want to know exactly what that personal guarantee actually means. Who authorized letting this woman put her entire livelihood on the line for this family? Porch. Before Rutherford could answer, I walked out to meet her. Whatever Vernelle wanted, I wasn't going to let people talk about me in my own house like I wasn't in the room. You looking for me? I said. I'm right here. Vernelle turned to face me, her arms crossed. The softer tone she'd used on the phone with Percy was completely gone. I didn't come here for you, she said. I came for him. Porch. She glared at Rutherford. He didn't sleep a wink last night, Rutherford. A 24-year-old kid, lying awake all night, wondering if his own father was ever going to tell him the truth, or if he was supposed to go his whole life believing his stepmother was a thief. Rutherford's jaw tightened. I know. Do you? Vernelle's voice rose. Porch. Because from where I'm standing, the person who kept this hidden for 2 years was you. Not her. You. Then, she looked at me. This time, the look on her face was different, less suspicion, more of a deep exhaustion. I've been hard on you, I'll admit that. But I'm done trying to figure out if you're some schemer. I don't think you are, and if I keep pretending I do, I'm just being stubborn. I hadn't expected her to be so direct. I let the silence sit for a second before responding. So what are you here for today? She looked at both of us. I want to know what happens next. Not about the money. I don't care about the money. I want to know if this family is going to sit down and talk, or if we're going to keep pretending nothing happened. Because I've watched my brother hide from things for 2 years, and I'm not going to watch him do it for another 2. Rutherford looked down at his hands. I don't know how to start, Vernell. Then figure it out, she said. Start with Percy. He needs to hear it from you in person, not from digging through trash in your office. I understand, Rutherford said, his voice quiet. Vernell picked up her bag, without the sharp attitude she'd had earlier. I'm not trying to make a scene, she said, looking mostly at me. I just watched a boy I helped raise almost fall apart in my kitchen last night. I had to say something to the person who could actually fix it. She left without slamming the door. But somehow, that quiet click of the latch felt heavier than a slam. I stood in the hallway, feeling an unexpected sense of unease. It wasn't the satisfaction of being proven right. It was the realization that Vernell's anger, from start to finish, had never really been about me. The silence was broken by the buzz of Rutherford's phone on the counter. He looked at the screen, then up at me with an unreadable expression. It's Percy, he said. He wants to come over tomorrow. He said he needs to talk to both of us. I felt my chest tighten. This time it wasn't fear, but a sharp, focused tension, the kind of breath you hold when the moment you've been waiting for finally arrives. The next evening, Percy arrived. He wasn't carrying anything, no folders, no evidence to wave around. His empty hands told me everything before he even spoke. This visit was different from the last. He stood in the same doorway where he had demanded answers before. For a moment, none of us said a word. Rutherford shifted next to me, but I stood still. I was waiting. I had made a promise to myself that I wouldn't force this. I owe you something, Percy finally said, looking at me instead of his father. More than just an apology, but I don't know what else to give you right now. So I'll start there. I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. 2 weeks into you joining this family, I called you a gold digger at my own dinner table. His voice was steady, but I could hear the effort it took to keep it that way. I said it right in front of my father, and when I said it, I meant it. I believed it was the truth. And then, when I found out you put your own name and your own money on the line to save this place before you even had an engagement ring, I didn't thank you. Instead, I went looking for something else to blame you for. He took a deep breath. I told myself you must be hiding something, that you were moving money, getting ready to take what wasn't yours. He gave a slow, firm shake of his head. I built a whole story in my head making you the villain because that was easier than admitting my father almost lost everything, and that a stranger saved us before I ever gave her a chance. Vernell was standing in the kitchen doorway now, quieter than I'd ever seen her. I'm not asking you to forget what I said at the table, Percy continued. I know exactly what I said. I remember it. I just want you to know I see how wrong I was. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to anyone. Including her. He glanced briefly at Vernell, then back to me. Including you, Aunt Vernell. You had your doubts too, and you didn't keep them to yourself. Vernell pressed her lips together, but didn't argue. Thank you, I finally said. Simple. Because I knew there was no point in holding on to the grudge longer than necessary, or making it harder for him to apologize. That's more than I expected, and more than I asked for. Percy gave a firm nod, looking like a man who had finally dropped a heavy load he'd been carrying since he walked into that office. Maybe even since 2 years ago. Before anyone could say another word, Rutherford's phone rang loudly. He looked at the screen, and I watched his face change instantly. "It's the Fontenot office," he said, his voice tight as the familiar panic rushed back. "George," he answered, listened for a moment, and then slowly lowered the phone, looking at me. "They moved the meeting up. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. He swallowed hard. "This is it." I felt the room freeze, everything. Percy's apology, Vernell's silence, the slow repair we'd started, was pushed aside by the reality of a 12-day deadline turning into 12 hours. "George." "Tomorrow," I repeated, steadying myself against the counter. "Then we'd better be ready by morning." The next morning at 9, I walked into the Fontenot Logistics conference room. I was wearing the sharp business suit I kept for real negotiations. But we hadn't been seated 30 seconds before I realized things had gone wrong before we even walked through the door. "George." Delroy Fontenot didn't have his usual warm smile when he saw me. He gave a polite, professional nod, sliding a folder across the table without any of the warmth I remembered from our years of working together. "To be honest," he said, once we sat down, getting straight to business, "I was surprised to get the call yesterday afternoon, agreeing to terms I hadn't even finished drafting. George. The renewal window was tight, and my team worked overnight to get this ready. I didn't expect you to be in such a hurry." I sat rigid in my chair. Rutherford shifted uncomfortably next to me. "What terms?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Fontenot opened the folder, turning it toward us. "A 24-month renewal at the current rate. George. No adjustments for the fuel surcharge and insurance increases we proposed in the spring. No scheduled reviews. Neither party can terminate before the 24 months are up." He looked at Rutherford. "Not me. This is what you agreed to verbally on the phone yesterday. My assistant printed it this morning for signatures, not negotiations." I slowly turned my head to look at Rutherford. "George. You locked us into a 2-year contract with no fuel adjustments and no exit clause? I spent all afternoon yesterday at the lawyer's office sorting out the release of the personal guarantee. You couldn't wait until I got back?" "I panicked," Rutherford muttered, refusing to meet my eyes. "George. When they said the deadline was moving up, I thought getting a contract locked in before the meeting would take the pressure off. You locked in a contract structure I wouldn't have signed in a million years." My voice was still calm, but a cold anger was moving through me. "George. No fuel adjustments means if diesel prices spike again, we take the entire loss for 2 full years with zero room to renegotiate. I didn't think about that." "I know you didn't." Fontenot cleared his throat, not unkindly but firm. "I have a verbal agreement with your husband, and I don't have room to back down from that. My board needs consistency. George. If I pull the offer from yesterday, it looks like bad faith. If I keep it, you carry the risk for the next 2 years. There is no middle ground." He closed the folder. "I need to know what you want to do today." I sat there feeling the true cost of Rutherford's fear. It wasn't malice. He never had malice. George. But it was the same old pattern. Acting alone, making decisions for both of us instead of standing with me. Even now, after everything, I didn't look at Rutherford again. I looked at Fontenot. I looked at the closed folder between us, at a negotiation that was half lost before I even entered the room. "I need 30 minutes, I told him. "George. I'm not here to throw out the verbal agreement your board expects. I'm not here to cut down. I'm here to add. One clause, without reopening the entire contract." Fontenot looked at his watch, then gave a single nod. 30 minutes. That's the limit. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked out of the room alone, my heels clicking sharp against the tile. "George." My mind was already moving, sorting through the only addition Fontenot's board could reasonably approve without reopening the whole audit. Behind me, I heard Rutherford's chair scrape back as he started to follow. I didn't look back. "Not yet," I said. "Give me a minute." I stood at the end of the long hallway, staring at nothing. "George." I knew that in 30 minutes, when I walked back into that room with a narrow clause, it wouldn't just decide the business or the house. It would decide if what I'd built over the last 2 years could survive another stupid decision made behind my back. I walked back into the conference room with 30 seconds left on the clock. I didn't sit down right away. Mr. George Fontenot, I said, placing my hands flat on the table. I have to admit, what happened yesterday is not how I do business. It's not how we've worked together over the last 2 years. That said, I'm not here to disappoint your board on the agreement they expect. I'm here to complete it. Fontenot leaned back slightly, waiting. Keep your payment terms, I said. Keep the current rate. George. But I require 3 additions. First, a performance review clause. A quarterly audit every 90 days so your board sees documented stability, not just promises. Second, I am the sole contact moving forward. All operations go directly through me. No middleman. Third, a renegotiation window. George. At the 18-month mark, if market fuel costs shift significantly, both parties have the right to review the terms. Instead of waiting until things break down, like yesterday. I met his look. You know how smoothly things run when I'm handling the account. Let's put that structure on paper. Fontenot stared at me for a long moment. George. Then he gave a small smile. The first real one since I'd walked in. The reviews and the single contact are fine, he said. The 18-month window is something I'll have to run by the board, but I don't see them fighting it. He slid a pen across the table. To be honest, I should have called you in the first place. Sign it. The drive home was completely silent. George. Rutherford kept his hands gripped tight on the wheel until we were almost back to the house. You saved it, he finally said. I recovered it, I corrected him coldly. There's a difference. I want you to remember that. When we walked inside that evening, Percy and Vernell were both there, waiting. The way people wait when they know something is finally settling. George. Rutherford stood in the center of the living room. For the first time since I'd known him, he didn't wait to be cornered before he spoke. I have something to say, and I need to say it to both of you. He looked at his sister and his son. Before I ever put a ring on Siobhan's finger, she saved this family financially. George. I let 2 years go by without telling either of you, because admitting it meant admitting I had nearly ruined everything. And 3 days ago, I almost ruined the only major account keeping this business alive because I panicked and made a decision behind her back again. The same mistake, just in a different package. His voice didn't shake, though I could see what it cost him to say it. George. That's on me, all of it. Not her. The room was quiet for a moment. Vernell broke it first. I owe you something too. She looked at me, her arms down for the first time since this started. I said things I can't take back. I suspected you when your risk was keeping me safe. It wasn't fair, and I knew some of it wasn't fair even when I said it. She let out a breath. I'm sorry, Siobhan, really. George. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. But I didn't rush to say it was fine, or that it didn't matter. It did matter, and the damage was done. I wasn't going to pretend it hadn't happened, just to make the room comfortable. Percy stood by the window, quiet. He had already dropped his burden days ago, and now he was just watching his father and aunt do the harder work of catching up to where he was. George. I looked around the room. Rutherford was finally being honest with the people who mattered most to him. Vernell had stepped down to apologize, and Percy had already changed. The accounts in this family were finally open. There was nothing left in a drawer. Nothing left for me to hear through a hallway wall. I didn't feel a massive sense of victory. George. Just a quiet, solid strength that belonged to me now, leaving me to decide what came next. A month went by before the house actually started to feel like mine. A feeling I hadn't had since the day I moved in. In the second week, Rutherford and I sat in a lawyer's office. His idea, not mine. We restructured the agreement officially. George. My name stayed on it, but this time, with protections that should have been there from day one. A formal LLC partnership. My role in the business was made official, not a shadow. Terms that couldn't be wiped out by a panicked phone call. 2 years late, Rutherford said as he signed. You certainly are, I agreed and signed my name. Percy started coming around more. George. No big gestures, no forced conversations. Just showing up in that normal, everyday way that matters more than any grand apology. He fixed the back fence on a Saturday without being asked, and he'd ask me how the Fontanotto account was running like a man who actually wanted to understand what he'd misjudged. On a Tuesday evening, dinner was on the table. Porch. Percy reached for a cigarette, caught himself, and stopped. He walked out to the porch, stubbed it out in the tray, and came back inside. "Sorry," he said. "Habit." "I noticed you stopped," I said. "Yeah, well," he pulled out his chair. "I'm trying to notice a lot of things I didn't before." That same week, Vernelle came over for dinner. Porch. For the first time since I married into the family, she brought a dish she'd made herself instead of an opinion. A peach cobbler, still warm from the oven. She set it on the counter without a single word about anyone's finances or motives. "It's good," I told her after a bite. "My mother's recipe," she said. It sounded like a gift, not just small talk. Porch. Rutherford sat at the head of the table, watching quietly. He was much quieter now, but it was a different kind of quiet. The kind that comes when a man has finally told his secrets and is learning to live with the truth instead of running from it. I looked at my family around the table. Nobody was smoking, and nobody's name was being thrown around like an insult. Porch. I thought about everything it took to get to tonight. The guarantee I signed, before I took the name, the 2 years of quiet work, the dinner where I was called a gold digger, and the house that would have fallen apart without me. I didn't have to burn the place down to get here. I didn't need to. I just stopped holding up a structure that refused to acknowledge I was the one holding it. Porch. And I waited. Not for revenge, never for revenge. Just for the people in this house to see what was standing right in front of them. And they did. All of them. Percy met my eye from across the table, a small smile on his face. It was that crooked half-smile his father had, but on Percy it looked softer, more honest. "Can you pass the cobbler?" he asked. Porch. I handed the dish over, watching it move from one hand to the next, and I realized that a family isn't built on the loudest voice in the room, or the sharpest accusation, or even the truth once it's finally yelled out. It's built on the person who can stand steady long enough to hold the weight. And in this house, for the first time, everyone at the table finally knew exactly whose hands those were.